Okay, it's about 4 minutes after, so I think we'll start, and then anyone who comes in, we can always let in at that point. Welcome to all who are here. Some of the names are very familiar and faces, and it's really nice that people are coming back to these webinars. We enjoy seeing you, and we hope that the information is interesting. Tonight, Corinne Wilkerson will be presenting on invasive species. And I'm sure you'll be interested in this because we want to keep those little devils away if we possibly can. As usual, once we get started, Corinne will be sharing her screen. So if you would mute and go out of video as well, so we just have the name showing until she is finished, and then we can reconvene and ask questions and see each other and so on. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Corinne and she can begin. Corinne?
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Corinne and I'm the Land Stewardship Coordinator at the Kensington Conservancy. So before we get started, I just wanted to read our land acknowledgement for you. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, and the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Garden River, Batchewana, Thessalon First Nations, and the Métis people. So thank you for that. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that okay. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the invasive species that we might find here in the St. Joseph Channel. I did my best. There's a lot of invasive species, so I did my best to try to figure out which ones we're most likely to see around here, and hopefully you learn something new today. Just give me a second. My slide is not going forward. Okay, so what are invasive species? So characteristic traits of an invasive species is, number one, it's not native to our environment. Usually they're fast growing and fast reproducing species. And generally they have a lack of natural predators in the environment that will slow their spread. So they tend to proliferate very quickly. And there's a lack of defense mechanisms in native host species. So if invasive species go on undetected and unregulated, they can easily become established in the environment and spread uncontrollably. So introductions like this can cause huge impacts to our economy, our ecology, and social values. And invasive species introductions are commonly regarded as the second greatest threat to global biodiversity, next to habitat loss. So they're of great concern. So you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between an invasive species and a not native species? So we have a lot of non-native species, but they're not necessarily considered invasive. So in order to be considered invasive, it must have been introduced to an ecosystem outside of its native range and has potential impacts on the ecology, economy, or society in the introduced area. So non-native species are not automatically considered invasive just because they're from a different area of the world. They must also be causing a negative environmental, economic, or social impact. So here I just showed you a couple pictures of purple loosestrife. That's considered an invasive species. Here in the St. Joseph Channel, it easily established itself along shorelines. They're quite pretty, but they outcompete our native species. And then down at the corner, there's common St. John's wort. So this is a not native species, but isn't considered invasive in that it doesn't really compete with our native plants here as badly. So what kind of environmental impacts can an invasive species have? Well, they compete with native species for resources like space, light, water, and food. They can prey on native species, and they can carry diseases and parasites that spread to native species. They also reduce biodiversity, which is the diversity of all living species in an ecosystem, and they'll put native species at risk. So thereby we lose some ecosystem services. So things like clean air provided by forests, flood and erosion control, and wetlands. So these services can be significantly impacted when we lose our native species and the habitats altered by the invasion of invasive species. So in this picture, you see a forest ecosystem that's been overrun by the invasive Japanese knotweed. You can see it's quite huge and prolific. So economic impacts. So the thing with invasive species is once they're established, it costs a lot of money to try to manage and eradicate them. So a recent study found that municipalities and conservation authorities are estimated to spend $50.8 million per year on invasive species management in Ontario alone. That's a huge cost. So if we're able to prevent the spread in the first place or prevent them from coming in the first place, that's a huge cost saving for us. So other economic costs include management. So we're going to have to, sometimes they're mechanically like removed physically. We use like plant pesticides and that to get rid of invasive pests or biological removal. We have research and monitoring programs to investigate invasive species. Invasive species can reduce crop yield, cause job losses, damage infrastructure, and impact international trade and tariffs. So there's lots of potential economic costs. So economic costs of invasive species are much lower when funds are allocated to the prevention and early detection efforts, because once an invasive species spreads, management is exponentially more expensive and less efficient. So here I have a picture of an emerald ash borer. Of course, I can't see what I've written there, but I know it says how much is spent on management of the emerald ash borer per year. It's in the millions. It's quite a devastating pest for ash trees in the area. So another threat of invasive species are social impacts that they have. So from a recreational point of view, the presence of invasives can threaten recreational spaces and compromise outdoor activities such as hiking, swimming, boating, fishing, and visiting local parks. So for an example, I saw photos of zebra mussels completely covering a beach, making it basically unusable because the shells from the mussels are very sharp and you wouldn't be able to walk on the beach anymore. Other waterfronts can be taken over by invasive plants such as Phragmites, and loss of trees from invasive pests in parks, and that will lose the trees in parks. Reduced fishing opportunities from species, native species lost in competition to invasive fish species. So there's all kinds of impacts. Sometimes there's mats of invasive plants growing on top of a lake that can get all tangled into boats. So another impact is human health impact. So some of our invasive species actually have some toxic qualities. So giant hogweed and wild parsnip are phototoxic, and if you have any contact with them, they can cause quite severe skin irritation. And then there's also the Asian giant hornet, which I'm assuming the sting would be quite severe. So another loss would be cultural losses. So the Asian longhorned beetle can disrupt Canadian maple trees. Garlic mustard competes with Native American ginseng plants. And then we have the emerald ash borer that affects ash trees. And each of these wildlife species has cultural significance. As we all know, Canadian maples are, they're our tree in Canada, so they're very important. And of course, our sugar maples are very important to our economy, and that's so it's part of our Canadian identity. And in terms of like Indigenous peoples use American ginseng, which has impacts from the garlic mustard. And similarly, ash trees have been traditionally used for basket weaving, so it's another huge cultural loss. So where do these invasive species come from? Well, in the Great Lakes, a lot of them come from trade pathways, so through the shipping channel, through the ballast that's held in these ships, the ballast water. Also, they can come from pet releases, so well-meaning people that don't want to kill a pet that they don't want anymore, release them out into nature. So some of those might include goldfish, red-eared sliders, which is a turtle, koi, and rabbits, etc. A lot of people have water gardens, and within those, there's some species that are used that can become invasive. That includes yellow floating heart, European water chestnut, flowering rush. Sometimes people bring in new species just for food. So that's the red swamp crayfish, but they get maybe dumped into water bodies and establish populations. And similarly, people use bait fish and bring them to different water bodies, and then they establish populations in there. So examples of that would be round goby and some of the carp species. And then sometimes there's invasives released for sport fish purposes, and that's a fish called tench is a concern in that respect. And e-commerce, this is put on there just because it's so easy to buy things now online. You could buy an invasive species very easily, bring it into the country and release it. And it could, if it could adapt to our climate here, it could establish a population. So this is just related to that releases, intentional versus unintentional release. So we talked a little bit about the goldfish and the turtles. That released by well-meaning pet owners, but unfortunately, you can see in that photo what can happen to a goldfish when left in a nice large lake. They can become quite big and then will compete with your native fish species and compete for food and habitat and other things. So be quite devastating. And then similarly, the red-eared slider is a popular pet turtle species, I believe from the southern US, and they get released and again are competing with our native turtle species. Unintentional release is spread through things like ballast water, which is the water that's held in the tanks of cargo ships that provide stability, but then the water will need to be released. And with that water being released, it can also release invasive species. And this is how we ended up with things like zebra and quagga mussels in the Great Lakes. So I'm just going to go through, there's a long list of invasive species that I got from the Invasive Species Center, but I'm going to go through, and I've highlighted here in bold the species that we're probably most likely to see in this area. So in terms of invasive fish and invertebrates, we've got potentially Asian carp, sea lamprey, round goby, northern snakehead, Prussian carp, tench, and goldfish. Thus far, we haven't seen Asian carp up in this area, but we do see sea lamprey and round goby. And in terms of invertebrates, we have the zebra and quagga mussels. I do have another slide. Yeah, I'm going to get into this a little more. We've got the rusty crayfish, marbled crayfish, red swamp crayfish, killer shrimp, spiny water flea, and the New Zealand mud snail. So the two that have been documented in this area are zebra mussels and the spiny water flea. I'm going to go to the next slide to talk about that a little bit more. So here's some photos of the sea lamprey. I'm sure most people are aware of this invasive. It's an eel-like fish that invaded the Great Lakes in the early 20th century through the shipping channels. And these latch onto the side of it and feed on its blood. Let's see if I can just mute. So they can be quite devastating to fish that they attack. Fish usually don't survive if they've had a sea lamprey attached to them. So these have been observed around Sault Ste. Marie, Echo Lake, and Little Rapids. And then on the right side here, we have the round goby. So it's another invasive that was introduced to the Great Lakes via ballast water and cargo ships. These come from like Eastern Europe. So they're kind of mottly gray. And how you can tell is that on that front dorsal fin, there's like a black spot, and they have raised frog-like eyes. So these will eat the eggs of native fish and compete for food. They also can spread botulism to birds and other fish. And these are absolutely illegal in Canada to possess or use as bait. And you never want to transport any kind of fish from lake to lake, and make sure you wash all of your equipment to prevent the spread of things like round goby. Okay, so in terms of invertebrates, we have the zebra mussel. So this is just showing how to identify. They're quite small, and they've got this like very pointy tip and the rings on the shell. And sometimes the rings are in kind of a zigzag pattern, as you can see in the picture. And these again were introduced through the shipping channels, through ballast water. They come from Eurasia, and they're considered one of the world's worst invaders. So again, to prevent infestations of zebra mussels, proper ballast water management is what's required. I don't know a whole lot about that, but I'm assuming that there's ways to properly dispose of ballast water so you're not spreading invasive species. Yeah, and then just the picture at the bottom shows a beach completely covered in zebra mussel shells, which would not be very nice to walk on or spend time on that beach without good shoes. And then on the right, we have the spiny water flea. So these have been found in this general area as well. And they were again introduced to the Great Lakes through ballast water. It's a freshwater crustacean from Europe and Asia. So this little tiny water flea You can tell, you can identify it with by this like little black eye and a long, long tail, be up to 7 millimeters long. Well, it's quite tiny. You need a magnifying glass to look at it. But they can very rapidly increase their population and monopolize food sources from native Daphnia populations, and they'll disrupt plankton communities in the lake. And as you can see, they can catch in clumps onto fishing line, thereby like disrupting fishing activity. So you can see in that picture, there's a big clump of them on a fishing line. So here's a few invasive aquatic plants. So again, there's a long list of aquatic plant invasive species, but I bolded the ones that we might see around here. So the first one is the Phragmites, which is known as the European common reed. So they're very tall, erect, aquatic or subaquatic perennial grasses, and they have extensive, dense rhizome systems underneath. So they're very, very difficult to get rid of once they're established. Now, it's important to note that there's lots of native Phragmites species. So you have to tell whether you have the invasive type or the native type, that because you might see some just on the side of the road, but they're not in these dense stands like you see in this picture. They're just the native Phragmites. So we also have water soldier, hasn't really been seen around here. Eurasian water milfoil. I couldn't find it documented around here, but I feel like that might be seen around here. Water chestnut, hydrilla, European frogbit. There's a picture of it here. I know that's been documented around St. Joe Island. So there's a little picture. It's a free-floating aquatic plant. It looks like a miniature water lily. They're quite small. The leaves are kind of round and heart-shaped, kind of about the size of a $2 coin. And there's a single white flower with 3 petals and a yellow center. The threat of these plants is that they break apart and decompose, and the huge because they form like these large mats, they can deplete dissolved oxygen levels. And when there's insignificant amounts of oxygen, fish and other aquatic organisms will die. And the thick mats will also impede the movement of fish and diving ducks and may get in the way of people trying to boat in the area as well. So the other invasive we might see around here that I know has been kind of maybe a hot item. So I've heard at the Invasive Species Center, it's one that's taking more notice lately, is starry stonewort. So this plant has white star-shaped bulbils, which give the species its name. So you can see them in that picture. There's they're not really flowers. Yeah. And these are deposited in the mud. And so they spread very easily because they're established like in the lake bed. So again, these produce dense mats and compete aggressively with our native plants. So similarly to the frogbit, that those dense mats of plant impede movement of fish, spawning activity, water flow, other recreational activities can establish and spread very quickly. So here we have our list of invasive insects. The main one that we will see around here would be the emerald ash borer. If you find an ash, there's a lot of ash trees, and you will see that they are not doing so well lately. Most of the ash trees I've observed recently have had impacts from emerald ash borer, and the way you can tell is in the bark. There'll be this little D-shaped hole in it, and that hole is made from the adult making its way out of the tree. So if you see those little holes in an ash tree, you know that it's been infected with emerald ash borer. There's a picture here of what an adult ash borer looks like. They're dark metallic green, about a 1/2 inch long. And then the larvae are pictured there at the bottom. Yeah, so individual trees infected by these, there's not really a whole lot you can do about them unless, you know, the tree is maybe in a ornamental landscape. They can be treated, but it's not economical to try to treat them at a forest level. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into the rest in invasive insects, only because we don't tend to see too many around here that I'm aware of anyways. Somebody might tell me something different. So invasive plants. So this is what you're probably most likely to see around, are different kinds of invasive plants. So we've got the giant hogweed pictured here. It's easily mixed up with wild parsnip, but giant hogweed is very, very large. It can be like 2 meters tall. It's got thick stems. And the problem with this plant is that it's got this phototoxic sap. So you do not want to touch this plant. If you see it, you have to wear special protective equipment to remove them. And the whole plant and everything needs to be put away in a black garbage bag so that it doesn't have a chance to spread. These have been identified around Sault Ste. Marie, Manitoulin Island, and Elliott Lake. So another invasive plant that we've seen in this area is common buckthorn. At least it's been identified in Sault Ste. Marie. I don't know. There's been no observations down the line in St. Joseph Channel area, but I could be around. So this plant is shade and drought tolerant. And so it's very adaptable and can outcompete native plants. You can see here it's got the black berries and kind of like leathery leaves. So again, here's a few more. So we've got Japanese knotweed, and we saw a picture of that earlier, just forming these dense, tall stands. This has been identified in Sault Ste. Marie and on St. Joseph Island. So this commonly invades disturbed areas with lots of light, such as roadsides and stream banks. And this has like an extensive rhizome system underground. So it's very difficult to eradicate because of that, because they can form these very dense patches. This plant came from Eastern Asia and was introduced. It's been around North America for probably about 200 years. So in the second photo, we have garlic mustard. This has been found around Sault Ste. Marie and St. Joseph Island as well. This plant is easily recognizable by a garlic odor that's present when any part of the plant is crushed. And it's highly shade tolerant as well, so it can invade high quality mature woodlands and form dense stands in there. And then in the third picture, we've got Himalayan balsam. And it's been found in Sault Ste. Marie and around Echo Bay. So its stems have kind of a purpley reddish color. And it's got the pink kind of irregular looking flower. And so this plant has like kind of an exploding seed. So it has a seed pod that if touched will just explode. So of course, because of that, can spread its seed quite readily, and each plant can produce up to 800 seeds. And it tends to be in high soil moisture, riparian areas, and can be partially shade tolerant as well. So purple loosestrife is another invasive plant I find it's pretty common in the St. Joseph Channel. I see it around a lot on along riparian areas and on some of the islands in the channel. Very widespread. It can grow anywhere on wetlands, wet meadows, river, stream banks, lake shores. Forms very dense stands that will dominate the area. And it's very prolific seed producer. So it can produce 2.5 million seeds a year, and it can hybridize with native loosestrife species. So it was introduced in North America in the 1800s for ornamental and medicinal purposes. I'm not sure what that purpose was exactly, but it's caused quite a few issues. And I pulled a bunch of this last year, and it's hard to pull out. I was lucky that the ground was kind of soft, so I was able to pull the roots right out. But it has very thick roots. The next one pictured here is called dog strangling vine. So this one, as far as I could find on, through the Invasive Species Center and another invasive species tracking website, EDDMaps, I couldn't find any observations of this in the area, but it doesn't mean it's not here. It just means there's no documented observations. So it's another one that'll invade upland areas. It can basically grow anywhere, and it'll dominate the understory of like forested areas. So it's again, it's another one that's very difficult to control once it's established, because it's got these like extensive root systems. The other thing that's interesting to know about this one is its seed pods look kind of similar to milkweed pods. They're not as thick as a milkweed pod, but they have those kind of long, kind of almost furry, hairy pieces that will float with the wind. So it kind of looks, I should have put a picture on there, but it looks very similar. And then the last one we have here is wild parsnip. And this one can be found on St. Joseph Island. It's been documented there. It tends to grow in very sunny areas. And this is another one that has phototoxic properties. So if you get like some of this plant on your skin and then you go in the sun, you could get severe blisters. So you do need to be very careful coming across any of these plants. And if you want to pull them, you need to make sure you're wearing gloves and putting them into bags and disposing of them properly. So a couple other things, invasive forest pathogens. They're all different kinds of fungal infections, and they can affect forests that are natural, commercial forests, and urban forests. So we have oak wilt, butternut canker, thousand canker disease, which affects walnut trees, beech bark disease, beech leaf disease, Dutch elm disease, and white pine blister rust. So Dutch elm disease is one that we might see in this area. It's been very damaging to our elm tree population in Eastern Canada in general. And white pine blister rust It came from Asia, but it's been in Canada since the early 1900s. It's devastated eastern white pines in eastern Canada. And it also affects pines in Western Canada, just different species, the white bark and limber pines. So the interesting thing about white pine blister rust is it produces two types of spores, and there's another host, so they can be hosted on a white pine, but they can also be hosted on rye-based species, so like currants and gooseberry plants. So this gives this fungus like a survival advantage in that it can continually infect new white pines because it has another host. Even if the white pines have maybe died and already been infected, it has an alternate host, so it can continually create more spores. So these are just a few other things that we don't see I don't think any in this area, but I just wanted to mention invasive land animals and other invertebrates. There's wild pigs, and these are actually becoming quite an issue out west in Saskatchewan and Alberta. There's scattered populations and issues with these in Ontario, but they haven't really caused too many problems thus far, and especially not in this area. Jumping worms is one that you might have heard of. I know they've been in the news recently. They were introduced to North America in the late 1800s, but more recently begun invading natural habitats, spreading primarily through horticultural trade activities. So these jumping worms can outcompete with other earthworms, and their castings degrade soil quality, and they're just not good for the soil at all. And then we have the red-eared slider, the turtle, that is originally from the waterways in the US, from the Mississippi River, very popular as pets, which is their primary mode of introduction is pet release. So these turtles can reproduce like very well. So that means they can compete with our native turtles who reproduce much more slowly. But I don't know, I'm trying to see if I wrote down how to identify from our Western painted turtles, but it's I guess important to know, when you're looking at a turtle, that you make sure you can distinguish our painted turtles from a red-eared slider. Okay, so that includes all of the invasive species. I hope you learned something there. I'm no expert on invasive species, but I'm trying my best to learn and to give that information to you. I got a lot of my information from the Invasive Species Center, which is located in Sault Ste. Marie, and they have a very informative website. And if you're interested in tracking or documenting invasive species, one way is through iNaturalist. So at TKC, we use iNaturalist regularly to document all the plants and animals we see on our properties. If you document an invasive species, it actually gets tagged by other groups that are looking for invasive species. So like if you document something on iNaturalist and it gets tagged as an invasive species, it actually then gets tagged on this next website called EDDMaps. So there's lots of integration with a lot of these websites. So EDDMaps is another invasive species information and tracking tool. You can document invasive species you find. You can also look on there to find more information about different invasive species, look at their distribution maps, where there's been observations, things like that. So another thing you can do to prevent the spread of invasive species is clean your boat. So if you're moving your boat between different water bodies, you should make an effort to try to wash it thoroughly so that you're not spreading aquatic invasives from one water body to another. So I just put this picture on here because I thought it's a little blurry, but I thought it was a good image of showing all the zebra mussels that were attached to this boat. And, you know, you wouldn't want to take that into a different water body that didn't have any zebra mussels. You have to scrape all those off. So another way you can prevent the spread of invasives is to clean your shoes. So if you go hiking, go into any kind of area, between areas, try to clean the mud and seeds off your shoes. And another way is to try to plant native species in your gardens. So rather than, a lot of invasive species have been brought in because they're brought in as ornamental plants to plant in gardens. So if you plant native species instead, there won't be that issue of an invasive spreading. And also the native species are well adapted to grow in this area. So it's kind of win-win. And there's a lot of native species nurseries now in Ontario. You do have to order online. I don't think there's any locally, but there's quite a few resources online these days to order native seeds, native plants that are, you know, some seedlings and things like that. So it's nice that those resources are there. So something TKC is doing this summer is we will be installing a boot brush station at our hiking trails. So we got funding from the Invasive Species Center micro grant program to purchase the lumber and the sign to make, we're actually going to install 2 of these boot brush stations, one at the Foster Parkland hiking trails and at another hiking trail soon to be announced in the future. So that will be coming up later, but we have the funds to put that second one up. So usually using these boot brush stations will help to remove the mud, dirt, and seeds from your shoes after using the trails. And actually it's better to try to use it before and after, so you don't bring seeds into the trails, and then after, so you don't bring them out as either. So this is just an example of the sign that's going to go on the boot brush station. Just started making this up, so hopefully we'll have these set up in the next couple months. So I also just wanted to talk a little bit about the invasive species micro grant. There's another project that's was funded through there called Grow Me Instead, and we're a partner on that project and a supporter of the project. So it's through Clean North, and they're promoting native plant gardening, like as I talked about a little earlier. So they're trying to encourage people to plant native species in their gardens instead of other like non-native and ornamental species. There's a lot of beautiful flowering plants that are native to Ontario, so it's kind of nice. And they're also going to be supporting people to seed save. So if you have native plants in the fall, to collect seeds and save them to plant for the following year. So the other way you can help is by reporting your sightings of invasive species. It's very easy through these apps. So if you're able to get a photo, and even if you're not 100% sure, you can submit it through either of these. Especially iNaturalist is really good with having people help you to identify if you're not sure what something is. So if you have a few good photos, there's people on there to help you identify. So you can, both of these can be done, both EDDMaps and iNaturalist can be found on their websites, which I put there, but they also both have apps that you can download onto your smartphone and just use directly while you're maybe out and about outside. So I highly encourage you to report any sightings because, like I said, with what I was looking for to find species that documented in this area, just because they're not documented, observed, doesn't mean they're not here. It just means that, nobody's come across them and taken a picture and submitted it to one of these organizations. So it really helps. It's that kind of citizen science to help track these kinds of species and help us get a handle on if they're establishing populations in the area before they have a chance to spread too much. So I just want to give a special thank you to the Invasive Species Center for providing the micro grant to support our program on invasive species. I hope that you learned something today, and thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me anytime. I will try my best to answer. If not, I can maybe find someone who can or find the information for you. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that we can open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask and I'll try my best to answer.
Corinne, it's Alice. I had no idea there were that many. It's kind of terrifying. I knew zebra mussels and purple loosestrife and emerald ash borer, and other than that, although I recognize some of them, I had no idea that they were really invasive. So thank you very much for that very informative talk. And I'm sure some other people have questions.
Okay.
Corinne, it's Tom.
Hi.
Hi. Any idea how prevalent the zebra mussel is in the St. Joe's area?
As far as I know, there haven't been too many observations, but they are around, but not in the sense like those pictures that we saw where there's,
Sure.
zebra mussels all over the beach and things like that. They're not prevalent in that respect, but they are here. I know Carter actually had an observation of one a few weeks ago, I think down near maybe the south end of St. Joseph Island. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's not nice.
I know. We don't want to see them up here, right?
No. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, doing this, I like Alice said, it is eye-opening of how many invasive species there are, and we are lucky where we live that they haven't had too much of a chance to establish populations, but with climate change and things, environment changing, they may, in the weather warming up here, they may have a chance to come up. So we'll definitely have to be vigilant and tracking. Did anyone else have any questions?
Hi, Corinne. This is Betsy Kingery from Washington, D.C., where we do have the spotted lanternfly, which is the latest terrifying fruit industry killing bug. I'm sort of surprised that you had the range of some of the invasive species, because we have Japanese knotweed and garlic mustard down here. And of course, we're quite a bit further south. But we have a program here in our area, and I think it's nationwide, called the Weed Warriors. And I just wonder if you have any kind of comparable, these are people who are trained specifically and allowed to go into park property, like the national parks here would be Rock Creek Park, and, take down honeysuckles and porcelain berry, things like that. Is that something that you have up there, or is it just too widespread?
Yeah, I don't think we have anything as organized as that. I know that, our local naturalist group will sometimes do pulls of like garlic mustard and things like that. But my guess would be that down like further in southern Ontario, where they have there's more invasive species down there, that maybe they have something a little more organized like that. But yeah, I'm not sure. But that's I imagine the more invasive species you have, the more interest there's going to be to have those kind of groups, and yeah, you do need special training to some extent with some of these to be able to pull them properly and get rid of them properly, make sure you've taken everything out. Otherwise, yeah, all of your efforts might be for naught.
Or you make them mad and they come back worse.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Coincidentally, I'm Kathy Pauley, also in Washington, D.C., and also a weed warrior who works in Rock Creek Park. Which
Wow, what a coincidence.
That was one of the questions I had to ask, or I had to ask as well, is whether there's such an organized program there. So I just had to, say, yeah, what a coincidence.
Yeah.
Well,
Kathy, I think we met at a yoga class.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's circle yoga?
No, well, not at Circle Yoga, but I do take yoga there. But I think it was Megan Jacobs and Richard.
Oh, yeah. Okay, right. At St. Joe. Okay, yeah. Not
I'll
here
see
in
you at
DC.
I'll see you at Circle Yoga or on the island this year.
Absolutely, one or the other. My other question was just, sometimes up at my cottage when I've tried to landscape with local blueberries, and I've asked where is the source to get them, and people look at me like, "Are you crazy? Just go dig them up," But I was wondering if you maintain any kind of a list of sources for native plants.
I do have a list because I did a webinar a little while back where I sent out a list of native plants, so I could definitely provide that.
That would be great if you.
Yeah, there's quite a few plant nurseries now in Ontario that are raising native plants. So this all started because somebody did ask us. We were doing a little planting program at the Women's Institute Park. It's at the end of McLennan Road. And so they asked TKC to come up with some native plants for them to purchase for their native plant garden. Oh, okay. Sure. Where do we find them?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I thought about if I knew where, I'd reroute myself on the drive north just to stop and pick things up in Canada because, we can't really bring stuff across the border.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'll definitely, I can provide those links
That'd be great.
for everybody.
Yeah. And thanks for a really great presentation. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. Any other questions from anybody else?
Corinne, I suppose it'd be a subject of a separate webinar, but I mean, I don't know how to phrase this correctly, but what kind of effort is out there to deal with these invasive species?
Yeah, I would probably have to do a little more research into that, but there are quite a few like large organizations that are involved with invasive species. We have our own invasive species center in Sault Ste. Marie. That is, and it is national, like it's a national organization. So they do a lot of like that kind of frontline research of what's being like what are the new native species which are having the most impact. They write up species reports and things like that, and then they do organize some on the ground activities as well. But yeah, there's a lot of different groups, so that would be, yeah, that would be something to look into, is to sort of compile them all, I guess, together, because there are quite a few. Like I said, there's that EDDMaps. It's all about early detection tracking, and they provide online resources for distribution. Like you can look up any invasive species on there, and it's got the distributions of all of them. So.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Corinne, it's Susan speaking. Just a question, and this is from the olden days. I don't remember, but we have a bug lab in the zoo, as we used to call it, and a forestry center as well. And are they involved in this kind of thing?
Oh yes, I mean I should have mentioned that, because they have a huge. I mean, they deal mostly with like forest pathogens, so and invasive insects. So, I mean, they have a huge quarantine facility, and they raise and rear invasive insects to study them. Yeah, so yeah, that all happens at the Great Lakes Forestry Center in Sault Ste. Marie as well. So
One of the things I might mention, I don't know very much about it, but we have a friend of my son's who's involved in it. And in keeping with your land acknowledgement that you did at the beginning, that I was delighted to hear. For example, the First Nations reserves in the Sioux didn't allow the forestry and bug labs in for some time, because understandably they were very suspicious of their motives, et cetera, et cetera. With the result of which, as I understand it, our lamprey eel population increased dramatically. And just these last couple of years, they have been allowed in, the provincial forestry thing, the bug lab, whichever it is, has been allowed in to, I was going to say chemicalized, but that would be a bad word, to somehow stop the spawning of lamprey eels. And so I understand that that's been a great First Nations government project that's now showing fruit.
yeah, that's great. I couldn't really speak to that too much, because I don't know a lot about that history. But yeah, that's, I mean, in terms of all the resources now, you know, when it's brought up, I think of, okay, there's the bug lab, there's the sea lamprey program, which must be through DFO, I would think. Yeah, so it'd be, maybe that will be part of what I do too, is just compile a list of all the resources and different groups that are dealing with all the different invasive species in Ontario. Did anyone else have any questions?
Good job, Corinne.
Thanks
Very
very
good.
much. And I thank you all for coming and attending and listening to my webinar. And I hope you all learned something, and or keep your eyes out and peeled for all these invasive species. But don't be too afraid. I think we're still okay up here up in Northern Ontario.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
so
you, Corinne.
oh, you're welcome. So if just call it, I guess we'll call it a night if nobody has any more questions. And I thanks again for all of you for joining in.
Thank you, Corinne. Good night, all.
Good night.